Most people, when they hear the word Pakistan, think of one of two things: instability or irrelevance. Turn on any major news channel covering South Asia, and the story is always the same: floods, debt, political crisis, another prime minister removed from office under circumstances nobody fully explains. The country gets covered like a recurring emergency that the world has simply learned to live with, a problem to be managed, a fire to be contained, never something to be understood. Here is what almost nobody in mainstream geopolitics will tell you plainly. Pakistan is not the world's problem. Pakistan is the world's prize, and the competition to control its future, quietly, systematically, without a single headline that names what is actually happening, is already well underway. 5 separate fault lines, each one independently capable of reshaping global order on its own, all converge on a single territory the size of Texas: the nuclear fault line, the trade corridor fault line, the water fault line, the ideological fault line running through the entire Islamic world, and the nuclear escalation fault line between two armies that have already fought 4 wars and are running new calculations. All 5. One country. That convergence is not coincidence. It is the most consequential geographic fact of the 21st century, and almost no one in mainstream analysis is framing it that way. By the end of this, you will understand Pakistan's strategic position better than 95% of people who have ever debated it on television. And that understanding begins with 2 numbers that almost no government wants placed in the same sentence. Here's the first number: $62 billion. That is the officially announced value of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, according to Pakistan's own Planning Commission 2023. But that is not the number that should stop you. The number that should stop you is 2,700 kilometers. That is the distance between China's western border and the port of Gwadar on the Arabian Sea. A corridor China is not building for profit. A corridor China cannot strategically survive without, because right now, 80% of China's oil imports pass through the Strait of Malacca, and the Strait of Malacca is controlled effectively by the United States Navy. CPEC is not an infrastructure project. It is China's attempt to cut a geographic lifeline that bypasses American naval power entirely. And Pakistan, its land, its ports, its political stability or instability, is the single variable that determines whether that lifeline gets built or collapses before it is ever operational. That is why Pakistan is the world's most important country right now. Not because of what Pakistan is, because of what Pakistan connects. But here is the part the infrastructure numbers do not tell you. And this is where the story changes completely. To understand how Pakistan arrived at this position, you have to go back to a decision made in 1947. Not the partition itself, though that matters. The strategic decision made by every major power about what to do with a new country that sat at the intersection of the Soviet Union, China, India, Iran, and the Arabian Sea. The answer, across multiple decades and multiple powers, was always the same: use it. Britain used Pakistan as the anchor of its post-colonial security architecture in South Asia. The United States used Pakistan as the frontline state against Soviet expansion, pouring billions into the ISI's covert war in Afghanistan through the 1980s, a program the CIA would later call the largest covert operation in its history. After September 11th, Washington used Pakistan again as the logistical corridor for its own war in Afghanistan. And throughout all of this, Pakistan played this role not out of weakness, but out of a very deliberate strategic calculation about what it was worth and to whom. General Pervez Musharraf said it directly the morning after the September 11th attacks, in an address most Western audiences never heard fully translated. We had to make a choice. We made it. That is not the statement of a country being pushed around. That is the statement of a country that knows precisely how much it is worth, and has been extracting payment for that worth for 75 years. But that is only half of Pakistan's strategic logic. The other half, the one that determines everything that follows, is the part that changed in 1972. And no one outside of specialist circles talks about what it actually means. Here is the question no Western analyst will say out loud on television, because the answer ends the conversation about every other country simultaneously. What happens to the 170 nuclear warheads sitting inside Pakistani territory the day its central government loses effective control of its southern periphery? There is a documented answer, and it is precisely why every major intelligence agency on Earth currently has more personnel stationed in Islamabad than at any point since October 2001. Pakistan's nuclear program began in earnest not in 1998, when the tests were conducted, but in 1972. The year is important. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, then Prime Minister, made a declaration that has since become one of the most quoted and least understood statements in South Asian political history. We will eat grass for 1,000 years, but we will have the bomb. That sentence is not nationalism. It is a strategic doctrine. the doctrine of existential deterrence, the conviction that Pakistan's survival as a state depends on possessing a weapon that makes its destruction too costly for India to contemplate. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists 2024 assessment puts Pakistan's current arsenal at approximately 170 warheads, making it the fifth largest nuclear force on Earth, larger than the United Kingdom, larger than Israel's estimated capability by a significant margin. And here is what makes this extraordinary. Pakistan built and maintained this arsenal while running recurring balance of payments crises. The nuclear program did not slow down for 19 IMF bailouts. It did not pause for floods, coups, or constitutional crises. It kept growing. That tells you something precise about Pakistan's strategic hierarchy. And it tells you why every major power, China, the United States, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, has independently reached the same conclusion. Pakistan is too nuclear to allow to fail completely, and too economically fragile to trust with its own future without external management. The British Empire framed a version of this problem in a different context. They called it the Great Game, the 19th century competition between Britain and Russia for control of Central Asia and the territories between their respective spheres. Rudyard Kipling wrote about it. The territory at the center of the original Great Game was Afghanistan. The territory at the center of the new version is Pakistan itself. The players this time are not competing with cavalry and trade routes. They are competing with debt instruments, intelligence assets, infrastructure projects, and the implied shadow of 170 nuclear weapons. And, as of 2015, China entered this game with a move no one had anticipated. Not a military alliance, not a treaty. An economic corridor that, if completed, would do something far more consequential than any military alliance. It would make Pakistan the pivot point of the entire global energy supply chain. The second mechanism is the one Beijing has been quietly recalculating, and the evidence is in the numbers that nobody in the financial press has placed beside each other. CPEC was announced in 2015 with a stated commitment of $46 billion, later revised upward to $62 billion. The promise was a network of roads, railways, power plants, and a deep-water port at Gwadar, all of which would give China a land-based trade and energy corridor bypassing the Strait of Malacca entirely. 10 years on, the picture is starkly different from the announcement. The State Bank of Pakistan's 2023-2024 annual report shows that Chinese foreign direct investment into Pakistan in the last fiscal year stood at $542 million against a $62 billion commitment, against a decade of announced timelines. That is not a project running behind schedule. That is a project that has encountered a structural obstacle serious enough to make Beijing hesitate in ways that infrastructure announcements do not reflect. The obstacle has a name. It is called the Balochistan insurgency. Balochistan province, which sits at the southern end of the CPEC corridor and contains Gwadar port itself, has been the site of a separatist conflict since partition. In recent years, 2022, 2023, and 2024, that conflict escalated directly against CPEC infrastructure. The South Asia terrorism portals published data records at least 23 attacks on Chinese-linked targets and personnel inside Pakistan between January 2023 and December 2024 alone. Beijing has demanded security guarantees. Islamabad has struggled to provide them. And the entire strategic logic of CPEC, which depends on Pakistan functioning as a stable transit corridor, not an active conflict zone, is now sitting on a foundation that neither party publicly acknowledges is cracking. This is where your economy enters the story. The International Energy Agency's 2024 World Energy Outlook estimates that 21% of globally traded petroleum products move through the Arabian Sea region. Whatever determines the stability of that corridor determines, at a remove of several months, what consumers in Europe, South Asia, and East Asia pay for energy. Pakistan is not abstract. Pakistan is already embedded in every energy-importing economy on Earth. Most people have simply not been told where to look for it. Now consider the second layer, because this is the one that changes the picture completely. India watched CPEC's 2015 announcement with a reaction that was not primarily economic. It was geographic. Because CPEC passes through Pakistan-administered Kashmir, a territory India officially claims as sovereign. From New Delhi's perspective, China did not simply build an infrastructure corridor. China built a permanent strategic alignment with Pakistan's position on the most consequential territorial dispute in South Asia. India's response was to build its own corridor, the India-Middle East-Europe Corridor, IMEC, announced at the G20 New Delhi summit in September 2023, backed by the United States, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and the European Union, is designed as a direct alternative to CPEC, not just economically, strategically. So consider what is actually happening right now as you watch this. Two rival infrastructure corridors are being constructed simultaneously, one backed by China, running through Pakistan, one backed by America and India, running around it. Both corridors represent trillion-dollar bets on which power writes the rules of 21st century global trade. And the country that sits at the geographic intersection that can either enable one corridor or destabilize both is Pakistan. That is not a coincidence of geography. That is why 240 million people and 170 nuclear weapons occupy a piece of territory that every major power on Earth is now treating as the most important real estate on the planet. But what happens when that real estate starts to fracture internally? That is the part no one is modeling publicly. And it is the scenario that changes everything. Here is where the three threads, the nuclear question, the corridor competition, and the debt trap, all converge on a single scenario that no government currently has a credible contingency plan for. Take a breath before this next part. Pakistan's external debt, as of the first quarter of 2025, according to the country's own Ministry of Finance, stands at approximately $131 billion. That is not a country in temporary difficulty. That is a country that has been borrowed into a structural trap, and the trap is tightening with each fiscal cycle. Here is the gap between the official story and what the numbers actually show. The official narrative is that Pakistan is managing a difficult macroeconomic transition. The IMF's April 2024 staff-level agreement, the 19th IMF program in Pakistan's history, was presented as evidence that international institutions still believe the model is workable. The observable reality is this: Pakistan's inflation rate peaked at 38.0% in May 2023, according to the Pakistan Bureau of Statistics. The State Bank of Pakistan's own data shows that foreign exchange reserves fell to $3.7 billion in January 2023, enough to cover approximately 3 weeks of imports for a country of 240 million people. 3 weeks. At that same moment, the Pakistani rupee had lost 55% of its value against the dollar in 12 months. And the IMF program that followed did not restructure the underlying debt. It rolled it forward. The debt is still there. The structural pressure is still there. And the creditors, both the IMF and China, now exercise leverage over Pakistan's political decisions that functionally supersedes, in practical terms, the mandate of any elected government. That gap between the announced stability and the continuing fragility is not a communications problem. It is the structural signature of a state whose economic model has reached its ceiling and whose next failure will not be managed quietly. Before we go further, something deserves a full stop. Behind every number in this analysis is a family. The United Nations Development Programme's 2023 Multidimensional Poverty Index found that 39.4% of Pakistanis, more than 95 million people, live in conditions of multidimensional poverty without reliable simultaneous access to clean water, education, and healthcare. 95 million people. That is roughly the entire population of Germany, not in a statistic, in a daily reality. Those are the actual stakes of every strategic calculation being made right now in Beijing, Washington, New Delhi, and Riyadh. Every debt negotiation, every corridor deal, every security guarantee, or absence of one lands on those 95 million people first. They do not get a seat at the table, but they absorb every consequence of what is decided there. Now, the dimension that no television analyst will frame plainly. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists Risk Matrix for 2024 placed India-Pakistan nuclear risk as one of the 3 most acute nuclear dangers globally, alongside Russia, NATO, and the Korean Peninsula. The reasoning is precise. Since the Balochistan airstrikes of February 2019, when India launched cross-border strikes inside Pakistani territory for the first time since 1971, both militaries have been operating under a revised set of assumptions about what the other side will tolerate. The old assumption was that both sides would stop well short of the nuclear threshold because the costs were clearly too high for any rational actor. The new assumption, according to analysts at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in a 2023 risk assessment, is that both sides may be actively miscalculating where the other's red lines actually sit. Under a scenario of a third Balochistan-scale incident, that assessment puts the probability of escalation into the 15 to 25% range. And that number is not static. It rises with each incident that goes unreversed and each domestic political environment that makes de-escalation read as weakness. Every student of Cold War history recognizes this signature. 2 nuclear powers, a disputed border, intelligence operations on both sides that neither can publicly acknowledge, and domestic political conditions in which backing down costs more than pressing forward. The Cuban Missile Crisis ran on exactly this logic. The difference is that Kennedy and Khrushchev had established back channels, and both men personally remembered a world before nuclear weapons. The current leaderships in New Delhi and Islamabad came of political age after both countries had already tested. That is not a comfort. That is the specific nature of the danger. Step back from the nuclear calculus and the debt numbers for a moment, because here is what all of this, the corridor competition, the fragility, the escalation dynamic, actually means for the question of who writes the rules of the next 50 years and who does not. What I want you to take from this is not fear. Fear is not useful. Panic is not useful. What is useful is the map. Because when you understand the system, the geography, the debt architecture, the nuclear logic, the corridor competition, you can see what is developing before any headline announces it. And that clarity is the most consequential thing available to anyone trying to navigate the world that is being built right now. Let me give the counter-argument a fair hearing, because serious analysts with genuine credentials look at everything just described and land somewhere significantly calmer. And their case is not trivial. Pakistan has survived before. It has survived 4 wars with India, a civil war that produced the separate state of Bangladesh, 4 military coups, active insurgency on its western border for over 2 decades, and 18 IMF programs before the current one. Each time, observers predicted collapse. Each time, the Pakistani state demonstrated a durability that is genuinely difficult to explain through conventional political science frameworks. The counter-argument also points to the diaspora. The World Bank's 2024 data shows Pakistani workers abroad sent home $27 billion in remittances, more than the country's total agricultural exports, more than its entire foreign direct investment combined. That is a financial buffer that standard debt to GDP metrics consistently undercount. And the optimists are not wrong that Pakistan has institutional memory for surviving impossible-looking moments. The honest picture, stripped of both the panic and the complacency, is this: Pakistan is not failing. But Pakistan is not stable either. It is something more specifically dangerous, a nuclear state whose internal fragility is now the central variable in at least 3 global competitions that no single one of the competing powers can resolve on its own. China needs Pakistan stable for CPEC to function. America needs Pakistan stable to maintain regional influence without a military footprint. India needs Pakistan stable enough not to escalate, but not strong enough to project power. The Gulf states need Pakistan stable to protect the largest single source of their migrant workforce. Everyone needs Pakistan stable. No one is willing to pay the full structural price to make it so. And that gap between the strategic necessity and the available political will is precisely where the danger lives. Watch 3 things in the months ahead. Watch the Gwadar port construction pace, not the announcements, the actual quarterly progress reports from the Port Authority. If construction timelines slip further without explanation, it signals that China is recalibrating its bet on Pakistan's trajectory. Watch the line of control. Any cross-border incident between Indian and Pakistani forces in Kashmir that results in aerial incursion, even limited, triggers a completely different escalation logic than anything that has come before February 2019. And watch Pakistan's next IMF review, scheduled for mid-2025. If disbursement conditions are not met, the fund pauses the program. If the program pauses, the foreign reserve window closes again. And if that window closes, the political environment in Islamabad becomes unpredictable in ways that carry consequences well beyond Pakistan's own borders. Those 3 data points will tell you more about the direction of the next 2 decades than any number of headlines about any other country. The world's most consequential situation is never the one with the loudest coverage. It is always the one where 5 crises are compounding simultaneously, and where the cost of getting it wrong cannot be undone. The world's most dangerous country is never the one with the most weapons. It is always the one with the most to lose and no clear path to keep it.